I'm Lance Waller. I'll introduce myself as we go along. Hey, Ron, good to see you. So I changed the title a little bit. The ghosts I've ghosted because there's not gonna be enough time. So, and I had bad blood before, and it's not a Taylor Swift thing. It's actually, I had the wrong name of the disease. The actual correct name for the World of Warcraft outbreak is corrupted blood. So I found some scary pictures at Nosferatu. You'll notice the one zombie in the lower right is wearing a mask. Jury's out on that. Okay. So, thanks. This is always, I've collected these over the years, and I'm going to give you a little bit of background how I got into mathematical modeling and why I think this is fun. I would love to teach an elective class on this. So,
Special topics, speaking.
Special topics. Pressure your advice. How do I get the next one? There we go. Okay, first my funny. Who am I kidding? No one would find this. Here's my personal experience from the 1979 Coombridge Junior High School yearbook. I'm in the member of the Fantasy Wargaming Guild. And then I ran in the, I brought the medal from the Run for Your Lives. It's a participant medal with the severed hand. It was an obstacle 5K through the woods, and you had flags like flag football, and the zombies would try to get your flag. I lost 2 of the 3 on the first obstacle. So the strategy for running this is the zebra strategy: go in a herd, keep moving. I tried, and you can see it looks like I'm cheating because I'm covering up the one remaining, but there's no cheating. Zombies, so and I do a lot of Bayesian statistics. That's Thomas Bayes too. It's in London, and in fact, in the graveyard, it's marked in the. But also, there's one called the Sunken Tomb. So how did I get into mathematical modeling with no formal training in this area? So New Mexico State University, my senior year in 1986, or maybe the spring of 1986, there was a mathematical competition on modeling. It was brand new, and one of our math professors told 3 of us who didn't look like we would be busy on the weekends that maybe we should do this weekend-long thing. We took a portable computer back to someone's apartment, and we programmed a model of managing a cobalt stockpile, and we tied for first. Oh. We didn't know what we were doing. We just sort of, Anyway, we had it so you could put in the political instability, and the model would buy up and hold. Anyway, it all worked. It was pretty cool. We thought it was fun. I'm from Los Alamos, New Mexico. Some of you maybe knew that, but after I graduated in December from undergraduate, before I started graduate school, I worked at the lab, and the person I was working for was bored with the assignment we had, and he knew this small group doing mathematical modeling of HIV. So this is 1987, and it turns out they had just started this group. I found a paper from 1988 talking about the history of HIV modeling, and Sterling Colgate, who was the director of the lab, started thinking that an immune attacking disease might be more of a threat to civilization than nuclear war, and some people should be looking into it. So they had sorry, let me get my Scooby-Doo book here. Somebody in the office had a sense of humor. So in 1988, Peter Denning wrote a summary of this modeling meeting, and here's some of the key things that came up in 1988. You'll be amazed at how different these are. Earlier in the week, many participants expressed suspicion by asking pointedly, "It looks like you modelers are telling us to provide you with our data. What will you do for us?" Why should a scientist release data before they publish it and fully analyze it themselves? Why should they give away the lifeblood of their scientific career? We still hear this. Single greatest barrier to more effective AIDS research is not technological, it's the unwillingness of people and institutions to share information. We haven't really grown out of that either. New technologies such as networking, CD-ROMs, software distribution, and innovative graphics should facilitate exchanges between those who model and those who produce data. So it's been quite a while, but we still struggle with some of the same things when it comes to working together. Now, with the new NIH data sharing policy and so on, there's more of a push to share this. you hear to those. So we can talk about it a little bit more, but mathematics is closer to, I mean, physics is a little closer to mathematics in the sense that once a law is established, you kind of follow it. Then you find out it doesn't fit everything, so you extend it. So that's where you quantum theory on top of these things, but it's extensions into a set of fixed laws that everything's supposed to follow. And the deviations might lead to new models and more details. In biology, we model things, but then we don't know whether it's noise or signal that we're trying to model. So I think it gets a little bit harder.
So you think that in fact the willingness or not to share?
No, I think the willingness of not to share is just deeply ingrained. When data were expensive and you spent a lot of effort getting it, you wanted to benefit from that. And now we're in a world where there's access to a lot of data. It may not be the right data, but you can get a lot of it. What does that mean? So the value now switches to adding to the pool. If you're not willing to pull in data from others, someone else will do that and they can work off of a bigger, broader data. So this is sort of a paradigm shift in the value of data. So this is something I'm going to talk about tomorrow at the AI meeting. The old model was data is expensive, so you work really hard to get the best, most information out of the least data you can get. Now we try to get as much data as you can and you hope it's good. So it's a good question. So, so I was kind of a spectator in those meetings, hearing them talk about this. I remember one day someone ran in and goes, "It's time to the 3 halves power." And I thought, well, I didn't know where that came from, but it was really interesting. Then so I was motivated by that, but that's not what I was studying in graduate school. I went into operations research and taking statistics and stochastic processes, and all my epi training was at a veterinary school. So I wasn't really in a clinical epidemiology setting, but I had the idea of populations that are poorly measured or observed and transmission occurring. I took a class on matrix population models from Carlos Castillo Chavez, who does a lot of mathematical modeling. He was friends with Mac Hyman and Ann Stanley, who were the Los Alamos group. There's kind of a family tree of ideas. And then, so this was in an engineering school, math, and then operations research, and then all my faculty positions have been in biostatistics, and I've been in schools of public health at UAB, Minnesota, and then at Emory. Mostly at Emory's when I was getting back into infectious disease modeling, because Beth Heller and I Longini were here and doing a lot of vaccine efficacy studies, and then got involved with PVE with Les Reel on his raccoon rabies project, and then I started teaching the quantitative methods class as an instructor, and we started doing some of these modeling examples in class. So you've all seen this, I have to put it in. So this is how we solve problems. You have a question you want to answer, the data you would need to do that, the data you can get, and the methods you have to analyze those data. That might include a set of models, what questions you can answer with that, and then how close is that to the question you wanted to answer. Modelers kind of like this part. My model's better than yours. I get closer to the question than you want to. Statisticians kind of try to figure this part out, and I'll talk a little more about that distinction in a second. So for the population biology, evolution, and ecology, pattern and process are 2 different things we often think of, where the process is what's really happening. That's the dynamic system that's going on, and you observe some data that generates some patterns. It's an echo of the process. In ecology, the models we're interested in are modeling what's happening and then generating observations to see if they match with outside real-world observations. In statistics, we often look at the patterns, and we know we're not talking about the real process model, but we're trying to describe how things are associated and what goes together. And the issue is that there's not a unique connection between these. The same process, 2 different processes could generate a similar pattern. Different patterns might actually come from the same process if I don't understand how it works. So it's not whether you get the answer, but whether you know more than when you started, and then you go around my figure again. So part of the question is, does the process need to be true to make the work interesting? Do I need to train you to be very serious about what you're modeling, or do I need to train you to be serious about how you're modeling things? And I brought my horrified movie victims as an example. So I have taken them out of the package. It's not like I'm waiting for their value to increase. And it's also October, so I have my copy of Frankenstein and Dracula put on my desk, and those 2. When we build models with pattern and process, two of the types of mathematical or computational models we use a lot are compartment models. These are the susceptible, infected, recovered type models. Everyone's in a compartment, they move to other compartments. So individuals move between the compartments or with the classes in the population. We have parameters describing how those transitions between them work, how fast or how slow it happens. And the SIR models we've seen a lot of during COVID, and that's a real common compartment model. Agent-based models are where it's like a simulation. The agents can be people, they can be counties, there are things for which they're affected or not, and then they interact with other agents and it spreads the infection. What's different about this is you're kind of following the individuals here. You have agents, they follow rules, like Mitchell's working on butterfly migration, where you have virtual butterflies migrating. You have people walking around a city, they interact with each other and maybe transmit the disease. So that we monitor what happens at the individual level, they're all following the rules. And we also see what happens across scales and we look for emergent behavior. So if people started wearing masks in a virtual city and so there was a giant simulation of Portland at Los Alamos for a long time. What happens if an infectious disease gets in there with a certain amount of transmissibility? How do people respond? So we saw examples of this somewhat. These tend to happen at large, they take a lot of computing. They're not as quick to do as the compartmental models. Compartmental models generally work on average. This works at the individual level. And so the game of life was the oldest one. I used to see screensavers where you had a grid, and if you had two things next to each other, they would color the one next to it, and it would generate sort of patterns would come together and go apart. And the Sims, any computer game you play is sort of a agent-based model or a collection of them where you're controlling one of the agents. And
can you define rules once the agents have aggregated? Can you define the sort of difference?
Scales of rules?
Yes.
Yeah, you could do that. So let's say we had individuals across states and then we changed the state policy. So your virtual state A might have Medicare expansion, the other one might not. So you could start changing the background rules in which the agents operate. There's a lot to keep track of, but as long as you can store that and scale it up, then you can do that. So there are lots of, just jumping into that, there are lots of scales of interest because there's a scale at which the process operates that can be at the individual level. Do I wear a mask and I interact with somebody who doesn't? There could be a policy level at different state levels. So sometimes political boundaries are real. There's a policy here and not here. And sometimes they're just the other side. I live in this state, you live in that state, but we really have to get within 6 feet to transmit this. There's also the scale of observation, for confidentiality purposes, I might not know where everybody is. I just know counts for certain amounts of time or certain places. And there's a scale at which you do your analysis. And if these don't line up, you can sometimes lose, that's the ecologic fallacy kind of aspect, or aggregate data analysis. So it's not that it's wrong, it's just that when you aggregate a pattern up, it might not look like the same version. So a lot of the early sexually transmitted infection models had random mixing. That might not be a good model for how people select their partners. And so trying to do that more accurately, you can imagine an agent-based model might do that differently than a compartment model. On average, it works out, but individually it doesn't. So every model has assumptions, and I like to think every model is telling a story. It's trying to describe features of the disease and how the transmission works. And then we want to line it up with data. So this book by Hilborn and Mangold called The Ecologic Detective, Confronting Models with Data, was a modeler's view of how do you start to put this together. And this is kind of coming ahead of a lot of the work now where the modelers and the statisticians and the epidemiologists are working on similar software platforms. So they're working in R where they have a package to do differential equations and regressions and they can start to put things together. So this is a really nice book if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it. It's a good kind of philosophy of data analysis models. I was at a workshop with modelers and statisticians, and it's like a middle school lunchroom, they sit on the other sides and make fun of each other. You don't really do science, that kind of thing. And what we realized partway through this workshop was they were kind of viewing things differently. Now, this is one of my other box and arrow plots. So there's the true model. This is the way nature's working. We'd like to know more about it. And we observe data from that. And then we might do regressions or something and see what associations are there. So the statistical worldview is kind of here. We see some data and we analyze it. We're trying to get some insight in how things go together. Modeler proposes a model. They know it's not the whole thing. It's a simplified version. And let's say it's stochastic, so you could simulate data, it's just not given. You generate observations and then you see how close those are to some data you have. So it's kind of a goodness of fit exercise. And their worldview is kind of these three boxes. So those two groups were kind of doing similar things, but they weren't really seeing the problem the same way. And it's, if I'm feeling more provocative, I will, well, now I've tried to buffer it, I'll be provocative and say, you know, most statisticians have taken at most one differential equation class, which means most of them took 0. Most modelers have taken one statistics class, which means a lot of them took 0, or all they know is a t-test, a chi-square test. They don't realize there's a whole bunch of other stuff you could do because the training tree breaks really early in the process. So how you're trained what to do in your field with data has split way before you can get to some of the complicated things that both groups in the more advanced classes really like to do. So one place that was overlooked is you could fit a complicated regression model to simulated data and see what associations your generative model created. See if it looks like what the epi literature or the biostat literature says they've seen in real data, not just see whether the observations look the same, but are you getting the same kind of correlations and slopes? So we did some work trying to connect those on the bottom with the raccoon rabies spread. And so I think there's a lot more you can do there. This is a ubiquitous Venn diagram, so I made a new one. So we've got the statistical modeling using likelihood, Bayes, regression, those things. Mathematical models, a lot of them are differential equations, and they're both working in the same software platform. So that used to be the figure I showed, but now there's a lot of computational modeling. I put the agent-based models there, but a lot of the AI pattern finding aspects. And so there's overlaps with these, but it's sort of complicated. They all use the word model differently. They're all thinking about how data fits in differently, but trying to cycle in to get to the middle, I think, would be more fun. Now, I mentioned the susceptible, infected, recovered model, and this is kind of the basic picture of it. You've split this population into 3 groups. You either don't have the disease and you could get it, you have the disease, or you've recovered from the disease or been removed. I'm just going to say recovered. And there's some rate at which susceptibles get infected and some rate at which infecteds are removed. The equations for this, it's a set of differential equations. And one of my frustrations coming into modeling as a student who wasn't taking a class in modeling is people would just slap it up there and go, here's the SIR model. And I'm like, you know, nodding, I'm not trying to keep a poker face on it. But the way to think about these things is everything has to go somewhere. It's going to be a closed population. The susceptibles, if they change over time and go down by this amount, minus this, something else gets plus that. There's always a pairing unless something's coming from outside or it's leaving the system. So we've got susceptibles moving into the infected class at this beta rate. The I times S is the infectives and susceptibles. How often do they interact? It's sort of a simple model of that. And then from the infecteds, I've gained the new infections from susceptible, and I've moved the infecteds that move to the recovered. So this simple model leaves here, comes here, leaves here, comes here. So if you're double checking the model formulation, just make sure everything goes somewhere. Usually we don't have things splitting between 2 other classes. You can imagine that happening, but it's a lot more bookkeeping. So we assume that the whole population is in one of these things and you're just moving people through it. Random mixing is the I times the S thing. There's how many infectives, how many susceptibles. If they're all bumping into each other at random, then I times S would give us that. I don't have any births or deaths. I'm taking the outbreaks over a short period of time. So I don't have anything coming into the susceptibles, and I don't have anything leaving any of these through non-disease related death. So the population's closed. The equations define the transition. If a fraction leaves one compartment, it must go into another one. And this is all from Wikipedia, so it must be true. I also put R naught in there. We heard a lot about R naught with COVID. This is the basic reproductive number. If everybody were susceptible, and I'm putting it in here because it's a function of the 2 parameters. You've got them coming in and going out, and it's how many new cases are generated, and then if you put an infected in that susceptible group. And the kind of graphs you would see if you want to think of the graph. So we have the picture, we have the equations, and you get a graph. You start with everyone susceptible. As they get infected, that number goes down. The infectives go up. Then they're running out of people to infect, new people to infect. They're recovering. The recovering goes up. So by the end of the epidemic, the infectives have dropped out because there's nobody left. Everyone's recovered and no one's susceptible. This is sort of the simple version of this. And the red line is what's called the epidemic curve. The cases go up and they come down. Now, some challenges with this. The parameters make sense. There's these transition parameters, the probability of transitions. They're biologically meaningful parameters. We like being in a model where things make sense, but we observe data that makes it hard to directly estimate those. Like we get the number of new cases in a month, number of new cases in a week. Without the right data, it's hard to estimate these because they might not be statistically identifiable in the data. So for instance, how can you tell the difference between a disease if you don't know much about it? Is it highly infectious and people are not contacting very often? Or is it not very infectious and there's a lot of relevant contacts? Those two things, you can't tell them apart just by having 17 cases. Now, there's a lot of applications of SIR models and variations of this. Maybe there's no recovered, you just become susceptible immediately again. Or you have an exposed section where you were exposed, but you're not infectious yet, and then infectious and then recovered. You can have coupled versions where there's vectors getting infected that then infect people. And there can be competition between different strains of the disease, like dengue, for instance, and finding out which ones gets established. But when you're thinking about a model, you're trying to figure out what are you assuming, what are the rules, what's the story that's going on and how infection works, and what happens if we change some of those things? What if we put in a prevention strategy? What if we treat people who are infected? What if we treat people who are not infected? What if there's a vaccine? So those all sound like important things to do with real diseases. So why do we model imaginary diseases? And what can that teach us about modeling? So thoughts? Two thumbs up. Okay, let's see what happens. So when you do an imaginary disease, there has to be some rules in the background. It's just that we hold them back and figure out what they are. So what are the assumptions and what are the rules? What's the story? What happens if we change things? Now you can change the rules, and we'll see there's some different rules on vampires, different rules on zombies and so on, but there's still rules. Often the game in the imaginary one is, well, how can I figure out what's going on and which model fits best? And how do we find out what these rules are? So zombies, what do we know about zombies? Class.
They like to eat brains.
They eat brains. Okay, that's good. What else do we know?
Bite people?
They bite people in order to eat the brains. Yeah,
I don't think they can recover.
so they don't recover. Do they stay zombies forever then?
I don't know much about zombies.
Well, maybe that's a good question. We should think about it, but they don't seem to recover. They're not a zombie for a while and then become susceptible again. So that's probably a piece of this. What else?
Can they turn normal people into zombies?
Can they infect? Yeah. So do susceptibles risk becoming a zombie through interactions?
I'm more of a rom-com person myself.
Yeah. Well, there's the rom-com subgenre.
There is.
Yes, there
It's
is.
called Prejudice and Zombies.
Yeah.
No, it's those categories. You go straight from susceptible to infection.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Is there a latent period for which someone's been infected, but not quite a zombie yet? Does that
According to the
build
lab,
dramatic,
there is.
dramatic tension builds with that?
Yeah. People have been biting me all day.
Yeah, that's right. What else? What about movement contact rates?
They're kind of slow.
Are they? Are
No.
they fast or slow? See, this is always the argument. Romero says they're slow.
Some feelings about this.
Yeah.
Their shows is so they can run.
There are shows with fast zombies. Now, see, that what's happened. The rules changed and we didn't know that rule changed. So that built dramatic tension in the fast
I
zombie.
think when they were slow originally, people were not afraid enough, so they made them fast.
That's right. Yeah, I think they established, I mean, some of the Romero movies start in the 70s, I think. Night of the Living Dead. Not that I watch all these, I just read about it. Yeah.
How to kill zombies.
Yeah, how do you stop a zombie? Can you stop a zombie? If it's not dead, how do you? Let's find out, shall we?
Are zombies just a metaphor for humans?
I think yeah, so interestingly enough. This book, Brains from Academics to Zombies, has some thought that the zombie has the other. And some of the postmodern view of zombies. But a lot of the zombie modeling had been around before, but this book chapter by Munz et al., and ending with Robert Smith, and the question mark is part of his name.
What?
He didn't want to get confused with the Robert Smith who's the lead singer for The Cure.
And that was his solution?
That was his solution. Makes it hard to Google. I'll just put it out there. Anyway, when zombies attack. So they wrote this book chapter in an infectious disease modeling research project book, and then the press picked up and it went viral because it had a perfect story. Like there's no way for the humans to win in their models. So, but let's see if that's a modeling assumption we're willing to make. So the original paper came out, then a bunch of people started writing blog posts about, no, what if it's fast and slow zombies? Then it changes the picture. What if they can move around? What if you can build barriers, all that? So the mathematical modeling of zombies book, well, prior to the whole zombie thing, Robert Smith, I don't know how to pronounce it either. This is a really nice math book on R naught and the Jacobian, and if you're interested in the math of infectious disease, this is a nice little book. These are all chapters of people who wrote other models. And then the zombies, the brains book, which I just finished last week, has more of the what about. Like the last one is a landscape architect's version of the zombie apocalypse. So we've already gone through your zombie assumptions. What are the questions of interest here? What do you want to know? Why are we modeling this in the midst of World War II?
Are we at risk?
Are we at risk? Will humans survive? Yeah. So if they're individual, there's a scale question there too. Am I at risk? Are we at risk? Okay. Here's the SZR model. So you're susceptible, you are a zombie, or you are not recovered but removed. So there's a pie coming in. This is a birth rate. Susceptibles are generating here. We'll probably ignore that because the outbreak happened really fast. Then there's the random mixing of susceptibles and zombies and a transition rate to the zombie state. Zombies can get removed by susceptibles interacting with zombies, and we didn't get into the removing of the head. The decapitation is ending the zombie. So this was a zombie removal through force. But they've got this chance of somebody who's already dead being brought back as a zombie.
What?
Interesting point. Yeah, let's think about that. And then there's the susceptibles who died without becoming a zombie. Okay, those are the pieces they put together. They said, okay, so from the picture, we can write some equations. Susceptibles get added in the birth rate. That doesn't show up anywhere else because it's external. We lose them to the same kind of thing we do as to infection, the interaction, or we lose them to death without infection. So that makes sense. The ones we lost to becoming zombies get added to Z. Z also gets these ones that are coming from the removed back. Again, I think this is an important point we'll need to look at. I'm going to draw circles around it in a minute. And then we have the removal because of the susceptible zombie competition. And then the last one, we've got the susceptibles who died, the removed zombies, and then from removed back to Z. Yes.
So I just have a clarifying question. That R category, and then they can move back to being zombies again after they're decapitated? If that's how you.
Yeah, so it seems like we need to have a distinction in the R category of removed head zombies or simply
Just
former susceptibles.
Yeah,
Yeah, so there's not that there. So there's already
Is
a
that what you were
little
talking
bit
about
of a
here?
hole. I'm
Sorry.
gonna talk somewhat about that, but that is the piece. So like, where do the transitions go? We were tracking them. Where do these transitions come from? The population's not closed because we've got the pie coming in. And then what SZ interactions are there? There's two types, the infectious type and the removal of the zombie type. So that's new from the SIR model. This is an unstable equilibrium. This is what they said happens at equilibrium. It's all zombies. Okay? Unhelpful graph. They said, well, what if we added an infectious stage where you could die without actually becoming the zombie? You're infected, but you never make it fully to zombie. Your friends remove your head and you end up there. We still haven't split the R into the two categories. So they said, okay, that infectious, that might help somewhat. And they shall refer to this, I cut and pasted pictures. The scissor model. So the impacts of the components, I mentioned pi is this birth rate of susceptibles coming in. And then we've got this, the death without becoming a zombie component. This is what I circled there. This is a little better, but we still don't end up with any susceptibles. The zombies still win. Just don't end up with as many. The reason the zombies doesn't go all the way to 100 is some of them are decapitated, right? So yeah.
So taking the heads of your friends, is that like putting on a mask for COVID just on the off chance that someone is infected?
Well, there could be false positives. So We can do sensitivity and specificity. Typically,
But if you say,
cinematically, I would say,
or an antigens.
cinematically, I would say they usually have infection, they usually have evidence of a bite from an interaction, and there's concern through increased aggressiveness. So that subtle change from infected to zombie might be a process rather than a simple transition.
But there are.
So is one of the assumptions that all humans are susceptible and not
Yes.
including any resistance?
We don't have any resistance, that's a good question, that's a way, we could add that in and think about how to fit that in a moment. Yeah,
Yeah, I have a question. Did the zombies like? I guess I'm wondering like if all of the susceptibles are eliminated, won't the zombies also eventually go
Will they?
extinct? Because I mean, if they eat brains and then I don't know if they can re-die. But I think
yeah,
that's
it's an
right.
interesting question, do they need to, and then we could get Dave in here. and talk
I
about-
know, I asked that question because Dave is currently teaching me ecology.
Yeah,
That's something that he would say.
but do zombies need a food budget? Or an energy budget, if they, can they switch to animals? But if there's nothing that wipes them out and they don't run out of energy, they're just automatons that eat brains for pleasure, not for,
But how do they not run out of energy?
I don't know. I
Biotech
mean, the movies never last that long. They do have the problem of decomposing.
Photosynthesis.
Yeah, photosynthesis, plants versus zombies, yeah.
The new show about what's the guy and the little girl, but it's a fungal infection.
Oh, Celeste.
They mutate.
Yeah, so we don't have any mutation or evolution here either, but for a longer term model, we might want to take those into account. See why we could do a class on this?
Yeah.
All right, so how do we change it? One problem I have is that any removed could become a zombie. So there's no, even if that's a small probability, if this model runs long enough, everyone who's ever died becomes a zombie, whether there's a direct interaction or not. So I don't know I don't know how to deal with this.
What is that Greek letter?
Zeta.
Okay, thank you.
I know that because Eleftheris Iakovou, a Greek classmate of mine, corrected a faculty member that's saying that was not a zeta that he drew on the board. He came up and drew a zeta and said, that is a zeta. The professor went on to draw it the way he drew. So anyway, that is a zeta.
Thank you.
So that's one thing you picked up from this. Yeah, thanks. Zeta for zombie.
Oh,
Great, got it?
great.
Okay, but yeah, this is a challenging part of the model because it's sort of like Murphy's Law is the law of total probability. No matter what the smallest probability is, if you watch the process long enough, that rare thing will happen. So we're eventually gonna run out of humans. The model is set up against us. So I used to give the final class project. When I taught quantitative methods every other year, I would teach the zombie model. And every other time I taught it, the class really got into it. The other class didn't get into it so much. They would say, why can't we do real diseases? And I first started teaching it because I thought we wouldn't get off track in arguing about the actual biology of the disease. If we were talking about malaria or something, little did I know the strongly held opinions the class would have about zombie movies. So, but yeah, I gave the final project, and these were the best projects to grade ever. The written reports would start with, if you're reading this, I'm probably dead. So some solutions, one class knew I worked on raccoon rabies, and they said, well, what if there's some competition, like a second species could absorb some of the cases? So they like raccoons, for instance, they said. So they had these models of zombie raccoons, and it was enough to allow some proportion of the human population to survive. There were people who had more effective human defenses that alpha, the parameter driving the zombie removal is higher. So we went, and yeah, another one was zombies wear out. We had that discussion. We could put that in the model. And what if we add a cure, like the zombies could become susceptible again? I didn't put where we add them back in, so they should come back. Maybe they're not susceptible. Maybe they're immune. But if I look at the zombie change, I've got the ones that are being removed, I've got the ones people are removing. And then if I take some out of this loop between zombie and dead, if I can take them out as faster than they're going in, we might have a chance. So what happens when I run it? If there's no cure, here's my epidemic curve. I've got all 4 categories here. The infected is the orange. It's still not looking good for people. But if I have a cure in there, there's a there, you know, I don't have any uninfected people living, that's a downside of this model. But we did, have the recovered stick around longer, so. So we kind of found the hole in the model, there was always a way to get more zombies, so the zombies would always win. I have a link in the slides I'm happy to share. This is like a US map of the zombie apocalypse flowing out. This is the sort of thing academics also do. It generates data. And then you can look at the pattern. It's very circular, so the zombies are not taking mass transit or cars. They're walking at the same speed in all directions. So I'll leave that for you. Any last comments on zombies? We got some other imaginary diseases. Yes, yeah.
Is there any progress on an RNA vaccine?
An RNA vaccine. I haven't put the vaccine there, but we could put a vaccine because, you know, the curing of the zombies could be accomplished with tranquilizer darts filled with a after infection vaccine, post-exposure prophylaxis.
Oh, like rabies.
Yeah, like rabies.
Should it not be like also times S? Because doesn't it matter like to cure?
Well, if you had to eject them,
Yeah,
then we'd want to have a ZS.
Right.
And
It's
that
like
would be
interaction.
random interaction, and all susceptibles had a set of hypodermic needles.
yeah.
So we could have that sort of thing, and then we could make it more complex.
I think it's
Could you also have like time varying parameters for zombies getting removed? Because like if you watch like Walking Dead, humans get better at fighting zombies.
Yeah, so the alpha parameter could improve over time. That's a possibility, that with better practice, and we'll actually see that in our vampire model. But yeah, yes.
What about with the isolation?
Yeah, I don't have any spatial aspect to this, but there are some websites that do this. It's, you know, and where they look like if you had a building you could protect and see, or there's rivers they can't get across, there's an island you could get on and they can't swim. But you know, maybe they can walk underwater. So yeah, you could have. But you could, that's where you could use the agent-based model version, right? And then the heterogeneous landscape gets a lot easier to deal with because it gets averaged out here. A lot of times people think that the agent-based model and there'll be an equivalent categorical or compartment model because you're just averaging out what happens to individuals. But I think just like the individual associations and group associations might not be the same, especially with heterogeneity. You could start showing that there's ways you could game the system and maintain a pocket of humanity because it's the parameters would also be spatially varying and they're low enough in a certain area to maintain a core remnant or something like things like that. So once you start adding the spatial and temporal variation to this with learning or geography that's better defended, you could imagine how you could have strong ones, and then would people emigrate out from there because that population would build up again, and you could see if there's a like pulsing sort of equilibrium. Yeah.
It's just one more thought, but I'm also thinking there's no heterogeneity in this model, right? So
Right.
you don't have super zombies.
We don't have super zombies or superhumans, the zombie killers. So if I'm now just the meta question of how you teach mathematical modeling, don't you feel more engaged than if we, you know, chosen? So some people are really into particular diseases and they get very interested in the subtleties of this. But the other part of the class is interested in a different type of disease and they don't dig into it. So part of this is not just facetious, as facetious as it might seem, it's more a problem-solving aspect, and I go back to the vortex of analysis. But how do we think about this? Oh, there's rules. How do I import this into the rules? But my gripe, and when I jumped into, you know, attending lectures on models, is they always started with a screen full of equations and then adjusted those rather than say, why am I even doing this? It took me a long time to figure out that I should be able to pair pieces up and find out where things go. And I don't think it should have taken that long. Now, that might have been a receiver problem rather than a transmitter problem, but we'll go from there.
So some of your latest models might look like a little bit, some of these diseases that end up affecting all of humanity. Let's say, CMV infection or EBV infection. Like everybody's infected.
Everyone's infected and then you build up immunity and it's, or there's enough, it's less, for those who survived the initial waves, it's not as severe a disease. So you can get into interesting conversations about virulence. Are you changing, how much heterogeneity and biological response is there in the susceptibles? Or are they all just carbon copies of each other? The math models are starting out with like carbon copies. Then maybe you could split it into different groups. But it lets you raise questions, and I'm not gonna get to the mummy paper, but yeah, the Pharaoh's curse hypothesis is that when they got into King Tut's tomb and then the benefactor died, was it a long-lasting pathogen? So what's in the best interest of the evolution of a pathogen, to be able to wait 3,000 years or kill off its host? So there's a lot of interesting mathematical laboratories where you can talk about what would it take in terms of these other parameters for maintaining something that's highly virulent. So how does something like rabies arise? What's the benefit to the pathogen? What's the benefit or potential benefit to the host? You don't want to kill off your host before you transmit. That's sort of our general idea. But then you get into these interesting questions like the Red Queen hypothesis and other things related to disease ecology.
I think what's interesting also about this is that the zombies are obviously, they're obviously zombies, right?
Right. So there's not a diagnosis problem.
Well, with SARS-CoV-2, most likely, most infectious people are the ones who are not uniquely.
Right. So if you think on the modeling side, like if we were making that an imaginary disease, it makes it spread really fast if we say you're most infectious before you show symptoms.
Yes.
So you can start thinking about that time
So kind
aspect.
of the eye.
Yeah, the time varying parameter that's certain to set up, where the traditional thing where you say, if I had symptoms and I cut off my exposure to others, that's a good thing. I don't have symptoms when I'm most infectious. So that's sort of the, sort of a ubiquitous thing. We learned about the transmission of that pathogen along the way.
But do you think that Zombieland, the movie, addresses that issue? Where like, I think one character, is hesitant to remove themselves if they are infected. And another Bill Murray cameos as someone who's trying to disguise himself as a zombie, so he shows the false positive.
Yeah, so you can start playing into what if you have less assurance of your class distinction between the compartments. Okay, so there's a lot you can do with the zombie models, and there's a lot that has been done. There's published literature, and there's just websites and example games and so on. The next one, the Corrupted Blood, appeared in the game World of Warcraft. I'm sure all of us played. I'm going to go through what happened with this infectious disease in this massive online role-playing game, how it happened, and what happened with players. So there's some interesting looks at this, published in places like Lancet Infectious Disease. So you can get publications on these. So what happened in September 13th, which I defended my dissertation on September 13th, because it was Friday the 13th, not this year, many years before that. So this, as you might have expected, allows you access to a place called Zul'Gurub. I don't know, for high-level characters to get in there, and you met this winged serpent character, Hakar. The players ran the risk of becoming infected with something that the game called a disease called Corrupted Blood. It wouldn't be that bad for the high-level characters, but high-level characters could transport to other places, and they started spreading it like wildfire. They set the R0 to this thing just unrealistic level, and it just went nuts. So there was also spillover between characters who were run by real people, and then also the non-player characters that the computer did, and their companion animals. It resulted in a game-wide epidemic that actually, I think they had to shut it down for a while. So the consequences, characters that had pets could infect the pets, but there was this huge penalty for allowing your pet to die. So if your pet got sick, people would just dismiss the pet. You had the opportunity to let them go. And then it would go on and infect other people. The disease was not bad in the pets in the category. So those were free to infect others. The non-player characters were also asymptomatic, getting to the asymptomatic component. They were infecting other people. So they have this intended spread through proximity between the involved characters and the pets. They programmed that in. Intended spread through direct action. The main source could infect both the animals and the characters. Involved characters could now do uninvolved characters as they moved around. But all these unintended spread, they didn't mean the involved characters to do the imaginary character, the non-player characters that then could in turn infect. So that was a problem. They would have uninvolved. So anyway, there was a whole lot of infection going on that they didn't think about when they coded this up. So it's like an agent-based model where a lot of the agents are controlled by players. And there's a lot of hand wringing and thinking about this, like, what did players do? There was some out, warning, warning, there's an outbreak. So, people just went crazy and they're like, well, I wonder if this is how they would deal with a real pandemic. Because remember, this is 2008. There's also two sets of behaviors described in this bottom paper: glitching, which is not, it's not hacking the game, it's just playing against the spirit of the game. And then there's griefing, where you intentionally go around and infect other people. Not cool. There's also the glitching example of the Kobayashi Maru from Star Trek. So people remember the story of the Kobayashi Maru. So this is Captain Kirk. Kobayashi Maru is a simulation exercise for potential captains at Starfleet Academy. Right? People know the canon. No one ever passed it. It was a no-win situation. They wanted to see how you would handle this before they let you captain the starship. Captain Kirk of the Starship Enterprise was the only one to have passed it because he snuck in and reprogrammed the game the night before and came up with a way to win. And then there's this ethical question, like, did he really cheat, or was that the point of the game, to figure out that the current boundaries, he said he refused to accept a no-win situation. I have this little toy in my office because I was a department chair. You get a lot of no-win situations. Also, Dungeons and Dragons ran an ad to try to get World of Warcraft players to come back and play. If you're gonna sit in your basement and pretend to be an elf, you should at least have some friends, invite some friends over. So, I don't know if that's sadder than nerd versus nerd. Okay, we have 10 minutes to do vampires. What do we know about vampires?
They drink blood.
Drink blood?
Can't go out in the sun.
Can't go out in the sun, or can they?
Yes, there's a question mark.
There's a question mark because of
The.
Twilight.
No,
Yes,
that's,
Twilight.
no, there's also the Dracula TV show.
Oh, okay, I'm not including that one, but it's good to, we need to.
Or like garlic, I think.
Yeah, garlic mirrors, what about mirrors?
Killed by a wooden stake through the heart.
Wooden stake through the heart. Okay, good.
Also, do they kill people or convert them, or both?
Ah,
Because
yeah,
if you
so
drink
what's
too
an
much blood-
interaction with a vampire? Do you become a vampire always, sometimes?
You always.
I think I'll be quite attractive because they're sexy, because that.
Yeah, people think they're sexy, yeah.
Sexy vampires and zombie
Yeah,
are.
there's not sexy.
Exactly, so I think people go to them. as
Yeah,
opposed
so
to-
there's a certain aspect of attraction to vampires that's missing from the zombie interaction. Non-random partner selection sort of thing, okay. So this is the mathematical interactions between species, peaceful coexistence of vampires and human, based on fiction, literature, and films. And you know this is good because they're all from Europe, where the vampires.
Everybody's
So-
from Romania.
Yeah, there's no one from Romania there. Yeah, Vlad the Impaler. So predator-prey models, this is also a couple differential equations. The Lotka-Volterra models, anyone done these before? The lynx and the hare. So you have predator and prey. You end up getting cyclic patterns. That's quintessential example from fur trapping data was lynx and hares. And if you don't have any hares, the lynx starve and then the hares start coming back. And I remember programming this in such a way that I said, what if I have like one rabbit and 100 foxes in my example, or lynx, and the rabbit gets eaten right away. And then my model started randomly generating rabbits coming back. And so I didn't show that use case in I turned my home again. All right, so we've got three options here. We're going to do the Stoker-King model. This is Bram Stoker, Dracula, Stephen King, Salem's Lot. The Anne Rice model. So this is Interview with a Vampire, Vampire Lestat. And then the Stephanie Myers model, which is Twilight. There's also other names we're going to add to this. I just did a lot of cutting and pasting, but humans, we've got vampires. I like the academic writing here. B0 is the initial state of vampire population. AHV describes the interaction between a human and a vampire, with A as the coefficient of a lethal outcome for vampire-human interaction for humans. We don't have to read through this, but let us calibrate. And then Jonathan Harker and Abraham von Celsin could not be by all means very efficient vampire slayers. And those are the two characters in Bram Stoker's Dracula. So they put C0, they had an option for vampire slayers to withdraw vampires from the population, just like removing zombies. They said it just wasn't enough. So we have a variant of these law called Volterra equations. They also set the time based on the world population to see what happened. Long story short, vampires win and people lose. So they don't think this is a realistic model because it's not what we've seen in the data. So,
Are these data would be available?
going the wrong way. Okay, here's the picture of the Anne Rice model. What it's added in is that vampires don't have to feed as often. In the Dracula one, they had to be invited in, but they thought they could get past that, but they had to feed often. Here they could go for, I mean, if you read the Vampire Lestat, he went hundreds of years without feeding. It wasn't good for him, but he was still immortal. So they started with 982 million people, 2 vampires, no organized groups of vampire killers. Slight variations are some of they can survive longer without food. So it's better for people. This is before vampires were introduced. This is on a log scale, so there's exponential population growth, and then no people that vampires grow slower, but it's not a stable situation either. So now we have the Harris-Meyer-Kostova model. So this is they can go out in the daylight. We also have a pretty robust vampire slayer, so the VS interaction. So Buffy the Vampire Slayer may fit into this as well if they were fully, not this sort of thing. That means the C is no longer 0, the Vampire Slayer parameter. They said, so this works for people. I like this. Figure with stationary solution on a logarithmic scale. This is a waste of graph paper. So they did say that the Twilight ones were more realistic than I don't buy it, but anyway.
I was gonna ask, does this include like interspecies interference? Because like the Stephanie Meyer, like Twilight series, I remember the vampires were always like killing each other too, so.
They kill each other and they can feed on animals.
Right.
It's not as healthy for them. And then the True Blood series, according to this paper, there's a lot of vampires and humans coexisting. The vampire blood is actually a hallucinogenic drug, so
Oh.
people are taking to get the vampire blood for them. So yeah, but you can imagine, it's a series, it's a new model, right? They defined a new model, the rules are different, you're watching the beginning and you're trying to sort out what happens. I mean, a lot of people are probably not doing equations or simulating it as they're watching this, but that's the fun of the story, is trying to adjust your model to come up with the equilibrium. This is a classic public health question of treatment versus prevention, whether you have steaks in the heart or garlic. And this is written in the Central European Journal of Operations Research. It's an econometrics kind of view, like what happens. So they have an agent-based model, pretty simple. So an agent-based model is a lot more complicated to set up because you have to track all the people. So you set the rules for interaction, you run the simulations to observe what happens. So yeah, population in patches, like a small area, are updated. Humans age and move. Marketeers move because they're also marketing the weapons, the steaks and the garlic. That's the economics piece. We'll see the results with and without advertising. Word of mouth communication. So there's interactions between susceptibles saying, oh, steaks work really well because I just tried it and it worked. And they have learning and marketing measures are applied, vampires are observed, utility of weapons calculated, either bred or one type of weapon is produced. You can either create food or you can create weapons. So there's a trade-off. So this is also an economic setting. Vampires move around. They may feed on humans and may be killed. Humans lose blood or may even be turned into vampires. Humans consume the bread or starve, so we do have to be creating the food. So this is interactive, splitting up of society. They consume blood or starve. Humans recuperate. Humans create offspring. Humans die if they're too weak or too old, and then weapons deprecate, and then they start over again. So they run and update the whole system. They also have some motivating rules like instinct versus reason. When I was in graduate school, we said there's engineering graphs or there were math graphs that actually had numbers on the scale, and the engineering ones didn't have numbers and had names, and then we finally got to the ones that had no axes. But instinct, zombies have all instinct and no reason. Vampires are, more, they're kind of moving more, they're strongly motivated by the need for blood, more so than people. This is kind of fun. Here's with and without marketing. So the baseline, they started out with 28 people with steaks, 19 with mirrors, 5 with garlic. Mirrors and garlic are really prevention, more things. Bullets don't work, silver bullets. They thought they would work, but that's for werewolves, it's not for vampires. And then no, and then they ran it for a while to see what they learned with, and they end up with a lot of people using stakes and some using mirrors and a smaller group not using any. But if you have advertising, it switched out the mirrors and garlic somewhat. So they played with like the garlic advertising industry, ran this really effective ad campaign. Anyway.
Pasta sauce.
Yeah, that's right. Any comments on, so vampires, you can also get into the subtleties of what their society is like, how often do they have to feed? So when do the interactions happen? Are there a subset of interactions that could be transmission? Zombies tend to be this, they're always there, they're always moving, they're not fast, but the infection just kind of rumbles on like the zombies themselves. Vampires are more nuanced and interesting. Yeah.
Seems like with like the mirrors and garlic, kind of like a prophylaxis for vampires and for zombies who didn't really have anything.
Yeah, they have there's nothing, like if you put a mirror up to the zombie, it would just keep going. So the mindlessness of the zombies is also the scary thing there. It's not that they're fast, it's just they don't stop and we need to rest, we need to eat. Now with dragons, this is kind of fun because Robert May, or May and Anderson, who was editor for Nature for a long time, found a paper in the British in 1976, and he wrote about the ecology of dragons, which led to a scathing response. They were arguing whether hippogriffs were in the same evolutionary family or not. They said no because of the number of legs and wings. Hogarth said that's not the important part. And then on an April Fool's, more recently, they had a nice Here Be Dragons, where they looked at like traditional climate oscillations and the rise of the use of the word dragon. This is the reason if I'm on your committee and you have a double-sided axis, I'm going to say don't do that because you can make stuff line up.
What is the first stir?
Well, that's when we first started reading about dragons in the 1500s.
Got it.
So there were no dragons mentioned earlier, but there were climate oscillations. So this little ice age, and then there's some writing here, and that just takes off. They suggest that a large-scale third stir is deemed to be imminent. That's a sort of nature thing to say. And then I am a published cryptozoologist because I used a Bigfoot data set in the book chapter we wrote. And the referee said, of course, this leads directly to the appropriateness of the Bigfoot example. So though whimsical is appealing, it's not clear that it's a good one. But I stood my ground and we kept it in there. So I have a long reference list, longer than the ones I've shown you, and it gets longer all the time. And if you're aware of things, I'm happy to look at it as sort of I think you could do an interesting special topics class on this, and we could do, a period of time on different sorts of models. The point of the model, it's not really to get zombie models right, but it's to say, how do we think of a system and turn that into a model and then learn something more about the system? Again, what could we learn about it? How could we change the system? And so it gives you an experiment stage where you're not, it's a relatively low cost, it's a really low cost experiment to do once you invest the time in getting the model set up. The one slide I neglected to include is that the CDC for preparedness and, before the pandemic had done the zombie preparation as kind of a, fun newsletter. And they got both positive viral feedback and negative viral. You can't believe you're using taxpayer dollars to talk about zombies. So that's why there's no funding of mine associated. And that's what I have today. We're right on time.
Are we missing like the part where the disease and the population get used to each other and stop wanting to kill each other and actually happy with one another?
Yeah, so the question is, are we missing the part with equilibrium? A lot of times we set up these mathematical models, we set those changes to be zero, and then try to solve for the parameters and say, what would a stable equilibrium look like and what transmission would have to occur? And because that sort of evolution happens in nature, there is interest in running this. I mean, the fun part of these is sort of what happens right away, but you could say under what conditions. And I think that was driving a lot of the zombie thinking, oh, these are the rules of how a zombie interaction should behave, but they always win. So we've been trying to figure out what sorts of things would lead to, and some of that might be the time-changing parameter. It becomes less virulent over time. The initial variants who are circulating aren't well accustomed to the host aren't well accustomed to it, but then over time, you might see these sort of.
Maybe SZ becomes a state, not just an interaction.
Right, and so there's some zombie literature where there's a vaccine, so they stop eating people, but they have to coexist. And that's actually one of the chapters in the Brady's book. Do we give them all the low paid jobs, sweatshops with the zombies working? It turned out that in the chapter, they're really good at dancing because it's repetition and memorized, but zombie,
It's like a thriller video.
yeah, they could, it's the thriller video, exactly, so they turned out they were really good at it, but as the sinews deteriorate, they aren't as good at it. And then the question is that their whole role is to be on the stage performing, so there's, even though some of it's tongue in cheek, it raises some important questions about how do we treat people in these different stages of the disease, and, so it's more than just I think it's more than a goofy exercise, but the goofiness of it, I think, encourages us to ask a lot of questions that we ask of real diseases as well. In a little bit safer space, if you wanted to say, what if malaria was transmitted by birds? And, someone would say, oh, that's ridiculous. We've never seen an example of that. But I mean, you're asking some interesting questions about plague and cystic fibrosis. How do those things go together over time? And the models give us a space to try the simple versions of things out to see if it starts to generate a process, generates a pattern. So I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did putting it together, but there's an awful lot more we could talk about with these, but it's important to have fun with your research, at least some of it.
It'd be great if you could share your references.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that, and I know they're in tiny font, and if anyone would like the slides, feel free to send me an email, I'm happy to share that as well. And I've got most of the references, so I can send PDFs of the ones I talked about today, and I have some additional ones too.